So what would World War II look like today? As of recently, world tensions have been fairly high, and that's due to a myriad of factors, such as the Ukraine war, North Korea, Taiwan, some Middle Eastern conflicts, and various civil wars and rebellions occurring in Africa. Given this backdrop, if World War III were to break out today, it would be pretty unlikely as of now, but if it were to happen, what would it look like? World War III would most likely be one of the deadliest wars in history, right ahead of World War II, and that's due to the fact that there are now 8 billion people on Earth. Let's examine what World War II would look like in the present day. I have done multiple videos on this before, but today we're going to focus on current relations and tensions around the world as of August 7, 2023. These dynamics have changed significantly since my previous videos, so if you enjoy this content, your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's jump straight into it. There are multiple ways that World War III could break out, and it all revolves around Russia and NATO countries. Typically, that's how I approach it in all my other videos. Honestly, what other way could World War III really break out? I don't think a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would lead to such a global conflict, and there don't appear to be any other major conflicts that could escalate this way. It's especially easy to conclude that the war would start with NATO and Russia because those two are currently at each other's throats, particularly in light of the Ukraine war and the movement of nuclear weapons. Let's say that the Russian mercenary group, the Wagner Group, launches an invasion into Poland. The Wagner Group operates somewhat independently, even though it used to function under Russia. It's a complicated situation, so if you're unfamiliar with it, I recommend looking it up and then coming back to this video. They launch an invasion into Poland for whatever reason, claiming that the Russian government is funding their actions. In response, the Russian government denies any involvement, which leads to tensions between NATO and Russia reaching an all-time high, reminiscent of the Cold War. It's also important to note that multiple Russian aircraft have been entering NATO airspace, particularly in the Baltics, and have been escorted out by NATO fighter jets recently. We can assume that a dogfight might break out between them. Imagine a NATO aircraft getting shot down by a Russian aircraft over Finland. This situation is essentially the icing on the cake, with the Wagner Group active in Poland, allegedly funded by the Russian government, and now we have Russian fighter jets engaging NATO aircraft. At this point, NATO has the justification it needs to declare Article 5, which is NATO's defensive clause stating that if one member is attacked, all member states will respond. So, Russia and NATO are now at war, and the world is starting to take sides. The global community is already quite divided between pro-Russian and pro-Western factions, with variations depending on the region. For instance, in East Asia, you might find more pro-Chinese sentiments than pro-Russian ones due to China's greater influence in that region. In Africa, the divide is more about American, Russian, and Chinese influence, but you get the point. This isn't your first World War III video, so with this conflict unfolding, Russia is going to call in some allies. They would need support because they would be significantly outmatched in this war otherwise. Belarus would likely come to their aid. Ukraine, being invaded by Russia, would automatically align with NATO, and we can also safely assume that Georgia would join the fight as well. It's also important to note that I included Sweden in NATO, even though they are technically not an official member state yet. Hungary and Turkey have agreed in principle to approve them, but they have yet to do so. Thus, Sweden is not a NATO member, but they are very close to becoming one, much like Finland did not too long ago. With Russia calling in Belarus to the war, we now have a large-scale front established in Eastern Europe. It's safe to assume that fighting would break out almost immediately, as both Russia and NATO have significant troop deployments along each other's borders. We would most likely see Belarus connecting with Ukraine to relieve any pressure NATO might be applying. It's also critical to recognize that this is a heavily militarized area, making it challenging for NATO to invade if needed. We can also assume that Russia would gain ground in the Baltics, not that they would achieve great things there, but they would benefit, as the Baltics have a severe deficit in military personnel. However, they won't be completely overwhelmed, because the US, the UK, and France have significant troop presence in these Baltic countries. So, they would likely manage to hold out alongside Belarus. In the conflict, we could see them pushing into northern Ukraine and potentially capturing Kiev. While this would serve as a moral blow for Ukraine, it wouldn't lead to their surrender, as they now have renewed motivation to continue fighting with NATO backing them up. Currently, South Ossetia and Abkhazia are occupied by Russia, and it's reasonable to assume that they would continue to occupy even more parts of Georgia, possibly reaching the Turkish border. Now, which other countries would join this war? It's a very specific conflict centered on Europe, with Russia and NATO as the primary actors. In previous World War III scenario videos, I mentioned that China might join this war, but today, we're going to say that they will not. This conclusion stems from the rising tensions and shifting relations between China and the US. While they are by no means friendly, their relationship has improved somewhat recently. China and Russia, while close allies, share a lot of the same enemies, mainly the United States. However, I would argue that the US has a healthier relationship with China than with Russia. With this in mind, it seems likely that China would opt not to join the war. They export a significant amount to Western countries and import a lot from them as well. In a war scenario, particularly one that would involve the US, participating would be detrimental economically, essentially cutting off one of their biggest customers. Not only would China's involvement in this war have significant economic repercussions, but we should also note that India, now the most populous country in the world, is witnessing a shift in economic activity towards them. Goods that used to come from China are increasingly being produced in India. Although China still has a larger manufacturing capacity than India, India's production rate is on the rise. If China were to join this war on Russia's side, Western countries would likely pivot to India, boosting India's economy. This situation poses a dilemma for China, as China and India have a historically contentious relationship. They may be part of BRICS together, but their rivalry remains due to ongoing border tensions and frequent exchanges of hostile rhetoric. If China were to enter this war, it could cement India's position as a blue team ally instead of a red team ally, particularly given India's alliance with Russia. With China staying out of the conflict, Russia would be looking for more allies. However, their options are limited. North Korea would almost certainly join this war, as Kim Jong-un seems to be acting increasingly erratic. Recent developments between North and South Korea suggest that a Russian-NATO conflict could quickly reignite the Korean War. In this scenario, Japan would join the war on the blue team alongside NATO. This participation might motivate China to join the war, but I still believe it's in their best interest to remain uninvolved. China, Japan, and even South Korea share significant trade partnerships, and joining the war would severely disrupt these economic ties. While America's involvement in a conflict would affect global economics, a war between China and the US would be catastrophic for the world's economy. I believe they are smart enough to understand this reality. Therefore, China will likely not join the war, even with adversaries like Japan and South Korea engaged. However, there is a potential issue that could push China to change its stance: the fall of North Korea. Such an event could happen imminently, given that North Korea stands little chance against South Korea alone. While they may be averse to NATO troops at their border, similar to the events of the First Korean War, there is a possibility that they could attempt to push back. That said, it's unlikely that they would take such action, as China tends to be pragmatic and cautious. Moreover, they might not appreciate the presence of American naval vessels operating near their waters, given the ongoing war. A large-scale US military presence in proximity to China would be unsettling. Still, I firmly believe that they would avoid getting involved in a World War III scenario for the sake of global stability and their own interests. With these new countries involved in the conflict, the shift toward the Eastern theater will create challenges for Russia. It will also be troublesome for the blue team because they will need to manage another front. However, Japan and South Korea are both among the top 10 strongest countries in the world, so they can certainly hold their own. Now that we've discussed Russia and North Korea, both significant nuclear powers, it's time to address the question: would nuclear bombs be used in World War III? My perspective on this issue has shifted. I previously believed it was unlikely, thinking Russia wouldn't resort to such extreme measures. However, considering North Korea's recent behavior and their threats toward the US, I now believe there's a possibility they could actually deploy their nuclear weapons. While that prospect is horrifying, I now see it as a genuine possibility. Realistically, nuclear bombs could be used, but for this scenario, I won't include them, as that would lead to catastrophic consequences and end the world, which isn't an enjoyable outcome for exploration. Instead, we want to analyze how a conventional war would unfold. Back in Europe, as fighting continues, we might see an eventual stalemate in Ukraine. Russia may push into western Ukraine, but with NATO support, Ukraine will likely hold its ground. The Belarusian front would remain tense and would depend on troop deployments, particularly from NATO. At some point, I believe NATO would counterattack and push Russia back to its original borders, potentially resulting in a massive defeat for Russia. Despite suffering losses, Russia would likely not surrender, particularly under Putin's regime. If the Russian army starts to falter, the Kremlin may resort to nuclear threats, but it's hard to say how that would pan out. I believe it would depend on how Western powers respond. Moving on to the southern front, we would likely see fighting escalate in Georgia as Russia seeks to expand its influence. South Ossetia and Abkhazia would be heavily contested, and if Turkey becomes involved, it could spark a direct confrontation with Russia. However, Turkey has a complicated history with Russia and may not opt to directly engage in conflict, instead choosing to support Ukraine by providing supplies. On the Asian front, with North Korea's involvement, the situation would mirror the Korean War. The war would be a proxy conflict with the US fighting for South Korea and China backing North Korea. There would likely be brutal urban warfare, as we saw in the past, and potential escalations could even lead to China getting involved. However, I believe the global economy would ultimately deter them from taking that route. In conclusion, a potential World War III scenario today would revolve around a conflict between Russia and NATO, with significant involvement from Eastern allies. While nuclear weapons may be a looming threat, it's more likely that the war would primarily feature conventional military engagements. The outcomes remain unpredictable, but this would undoubtedly mark a dark chapter in human history, significantly affecting global dynamics for years to come.